We're good? All right. I think we're good to start. Thanks, everyone, for showing up. My name's Melody Lay. I am out here from Toronto. I work with the Government of Ontario in the Cybersecurity Operations Branch. And I'm just here to make sure this session runs smoothly and everything. He's the guy that's going to be doing all the talking. So this is Guzman. He's a security consultant out of the LA area. And I'm going to let him give you the rest of the intro on himself. But he's here to give a talk called Don't Get Caught in Bed, Finding and Preventing Vulns at its Lowest Level. So, thanks, Aaron.
Thank you. Yep, so quite a long way trip over here. But we're going to be talking about embedded security as far as embedded devices and even some IoT. Who is familiar with embedded technology itself? Anybody work for manufacturers? Awesome. Anybody do any reverse engineering of embedded devices? How about on the hardware hacking side? The firmware side? Okay, awesome. Some people. Don't worry, we'll get through some of the groundwork for embedded and what that entails. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, so my name is Aaron Guzman. I have my Twitter handle up here. Usually I tweet out the slides as well as my research. So I am based in LA. Currently work over with SecureWorks as a pen tester, consultant doing a number of things from AppSec as well as the web services and API testing, web application testing, a number of things as well. I previously used to work for Balkan and Linksys. That's kind of where I got into the embedded side. But a quick note, as far as SecureWorks, I also do some pen testing against IoT vendors as well, whether it's commercial or the consumer side. But from the manufacturer perspective, this is how I got a lot of the guidance and ideas and reverse engineering expertise from working on the manufacturer side of things. I'm currently a board member for OWASP Los Angeles the last 3.5, 4 years now, as well as a board member for Cloud Security Alliance Southern California, previous president as well. I also contribute to a lot of guidance documents for IoT within Cloud Security Alliance and even OWASP. So the OWASP IoT project, or even the mobile project as well, and the embedded application security project, which a lot of what I'm going to talk about today references. As you can see, I love pizza. Funny story, I actually ordered some pizza last night. And over here, they have a 20-minute guarantee. And I was banking on a free pizza. I was like, there's no way this guy's gonna bake my pizza, come up to the 8th floor and deliver my pizza. And literally, I was watching the clock. Down to a minute, I hear a knock. I was like, oh, I was even Snapchatting. I was like, he's not gonna make it, this guy's probably running. And I was like, no way, 20 minutes to bake my pizza at my door. And I thought that was hilarious. If they did that back home, I'd be getting free pizzas all the time. Aside from that, I've spoken at DEF CON the last couple years at the IoT Village, and hopefully this year as well. I have some car hacking research that I'm hoping to release with Subaru. It's been fixed, so no 0 days drop in today. Spoken at DerbyCon as well as RSA, Hackfest over in Canada, AppSec USA, AppSec EU, as well as I help organize AppSec California. So AppSec California, we host a conference out on Santa Monica Beach, literally on the beach, the last week of January. So I run the volunteer, so if you guys are looking to volunteer, I can get you in for free. Shameless plug, but if anybody wants to move away from, if anybody's in a cloudy area or rainy area, it's definitely a place to go. I previously edited a Practical Internet of Things security book. That was about last year for Packet Publishing. I'm currently writing a book for IoT pen testing. It's called an IoT Pen Testing Cookbook. So it's everything from hardware hacking to firmware reverse engineering to embedded web application pen testing, as well as Bluetooth, Z-Wave, and Zigbee exploitation techniques. So that should be coming out later on this year. I do have some CVEs under my belt. Pain if you guys ever got through the CVE process. So let's go ahead and get started. So embedded devices and technology. Let's kind of lay the groundwork here. Loosely, generally, embedded is IoT. Aside from back in the day, embedded, they weren't connected devices. They didn't have connectivity. They weren't running on these interesting RF protocols and network access, IP TCP/IP, but loosely embedded is IoT, especially nowadays. So you might be familiar with connected vehicles already, wearables, implantables as well, pacemakers, even the medical devices that are managing these wearable devices, smart home infrastructures, even smart cities as well, with voice over IP phones. Some of you guys may be familiar with SIP and the way IP phones and IP cameras as well communicate over the network, and it may even be publicly accessible. I know it sounds odd, but it's definitely a way these devices are deployed. But yeah, car hacking research, again, as far as the inputs and outputs for any of these type of devices, there's always the RF side, there's always the firmware side, and they have some sort of management interface, whether that be a mobile app, a web application, or just general protocols, or some sort of IoT hub, whether it's commercial or consumer. So let's just talk about a little bit of the threats that happened last year. Who's familiar with Mirai? Awesome, cool. But as far as medical is concerned, it's the same patterns year after year: clear text communications, privacy concerns, denial of service, exploits and vulnerabilities. And even now, with WannaCry, these medical devices are affected. They're running XP, legacy XP, and they cannot be updated based off of the manufacturers who are, like Siemens, for example, who are selling these devices. It's a really interesting aspect of how these, IoT embedded devices, they're running. I'll go through the platforms that these embedded devices are running. But speaking about last year, ton of command injection vulnerabilities, remote code execution. This could be, again, from the commercial consumer side, and even the industrial control systems with PLCs as well. We have some interesting attack vectors and threats like ransomware, for example. Who's heard of the hotel that everybody got locked in Austria? Now, it wasn't the door controllers that actually got held for ransom. It was the credit card machines, but still, the credit card machines are an embedded device and did prevent usage. But think about how connected vehicles and ransomware are going to be affected. What's locking yourself out of your car, or having something in your infotainment system pop up. You need to pay a certain number of Bitcoin in order for your car to brake. It's going to go however fast, over kilometers and miles per hour. Otherwise, it won't stop. I know I would stop. But again, I talked about Mirai, and Mirai was huge, and it is huge. It's changed the way IoT security and the way devices are communicating over, say, botnet C2 communications, and it's affected. Obviously, it took down our portion of the internet with. I found out I was listening to SoundCloud. I was like, what happened to SoundCloud? I thought it was my router or something like that. And Twitter went down. We have Etsy, GitHub, all because these infected or malware infected IP cameras and DVRs had insecure defaults for either hard-coded passwords or, say, backdoors, or default username and passwords, or I don't think there were many 0 days dropped. But again, it was huge. And now what Mirai has done for the industry is created a template for IoT botnets. The code for Mirai is open source. So now anybody can kind of tailor the Mirai code to, let's say, it's going to happen, ransomware, for example. I know it's probably a name that's thrown out here, here and there throughout the conference, and even through some of the magazines and blogs you might read. But again, Mirai was huge. You probably have the 400-pound hacker supposedly, running these scripts. If you don't know the reference, it's fine. But again, the template for Mirai, we have these new strands of these IoT botnets: Hijame, Brickerbot, Perserai, which is a new one that got released, I think, last week, 2 weeks ago. Chermako did research on this particular strand. But what Brickerbot does is basically brick the embedded device for usage, so it doesn't have network connectivity. And then the other one is disable services, so that way no other attacker can get access to the affected device. Similar to Mirai, again, they're using Mirai's code. They're just tailoring it like any other developer would to whatever their needs are, and even staying persistent now. So they're known as like vigilante type of botnets, supposedly, but we still don't know what the exact intent for infecting these devices are, other than killing the services and killing the network connectivity to the internet to affect this big DDoS that happened last year. So again, it's all open source. It's a big problem. It's only going to change. Like I said, I'm counting the days till when I see a ransomware botnet show up for IoT devices. I know if there's a command injection vulnerability, you can easily sideload and create a Bitcoin page and prevent the use of the device. This has been shown last year at DEF CON IoT Village with the thermostat. But again, that might be playing games, lock down someone's thermostat, use someone's smart lock, hike up the heat, and grandpa, whoever's in there, may become very sick, something like that. Sounds like a college prank, but still could be real. Same thing with the car and the vehicle. And all they're doing, if you reset the device, you're just recapturing that vulnerable device, because even if you change the username and password, some of these hard-coded credentials are in the firmware, baked in. You can't change that password. You can't change that Telnet, I know it's Telnet, it's a shame. That Telnet password, you literally just rerun the script, capture more, and do with what you need with them. In essence, it's turned into an Internet of Pwns. It's just a game now. Who can get the more embedded devices within their realm, and whatever you want to do with them is up to you as an attacker, which is interesting from the internet standpoint. Now, I'm sure within the next couple of years, we'll see what the effects will be. And like I said, especially with these new strands. And usually how these type of vulnerabilities are found through the attackers who build something like Mirai. They have to go through a number of different manufacturers and acquire their firmware by a number of means, whether that be man in the middling, their OTA over-the-air update, or man in the middling, or looking at the mobile applications or the web applications during firmware update, or through some sort of hardware means, UART, JTAG, pulling the firmware, or SOIC clip, put it on top of the EEPROM. After that, you would typically analyze the firmware, the file system contents, and extract the file system contents. So something like CramFS, SquashFS, super common within consumer devices. Then what you'd want to do next, as far as the methodology is concerned, you want to mount the file system so you can see the configuration files, how they react, or how they work or function, which would be actually emulating the firmware. And that's for dynamic analysis. So using something like Burp or Zap. Who's familiar with Burp Suite? Okay, cool. OAuth Zap, anybody? It's free? Okay. But something for runtime analysis would be like GDB. That's usually how you find these buffer overflows, stack overflows, heap overflows. You'll use breakpoints with GDB or Frida, for example. You can use a number of different tools out there. But this is a general methodology that someone would use in order to reverse engineer a piece of firmware, specifically the firmware. This can be also translated into any other type of software, like a thick app, for example, a Java app, something like that. Similar content to any type of reverse engineering. Just change the terms around, and it'll work for you. But I have some firmware analysis tools if you haven't been exposed to this space. One of them I'm going to show is called Binwalk. Anybody heard of Binwalk? Sweet. OK, so cool. Only a couple. So we'll just show a brief example. It's really simple tool to use to extract the file system and the contents, and you can view the configuration files and see if there's any hard-coded passwords. And we'll go through that right now. Live demo, so we'll see how this works. All right, so I created AusCERT directory here. What I have is a vulnerable piece of firmware, a binary image. And this happens to be an image that's affected by Mirai. So what I'm going to look for is a hard-coded username and password, or root username and password with admin access. So right here is Binwalk, the tool Binwalk, and -E is extract. So I'm going to extract the file system contents for this binary image here. And if you want to know the file system or what type of file system is being used by the binary image, I'll just take a step back here and just run Binwalk by itself. You can do just file as well, or type. And you can see that there are a number of different images within this one firmware. But looks like they're using CramFS. So we'll go ahead and extract. And then we'll go ahead and change the directories into the extracted binary image, firmware image. Now let's look here. Now we see a number of different firmware files here, image files, CramFS, ROMFS, UserFS, web. There's probably different configuration files or separating them too, based off features, whatever it may be. Every firmware image is kind of different. This is for an IP camera. So again, Mirai, IP cameras, DVRs are affected. So since these are our binary image again, we're going to run binwalk again. So let's run binwalk. And I believe it's ROM FS, same thing. Let's CD into there. Let's just go into the root file system, etc, password. And here we go. Just hard-coded root password here that can never be changed, baked in by the original device manufacturer of the IP camera and the affected cameras for Mirai, actually. So it's pretty simple. It's not always going to be this simple. There's different vendors that will use or modify the file system so you can't use tools like binwalk and you have to look for magic headers. That's probably more down the line when you get deeper into firmware exploitation. But generally, if you go down and download an ASUS or Netgear or a D-Link or something like that, router specifically, you'll be able to use binwalk and extract the file system contents.
Do you know what the password was?
Yeah, I do. XMHDIPC and root.
Cool.
And plenty of people who consultant agencies, whatever it may be, or firms. Everybody has like crack machines now, so now we use like Mirai as one of the word lists. If they're going to attack, or they see IP camera or DVR within their network. So again, it kind of translates from consumer to small businesses, also to enterprises where they're being used. And most of these IP cameras are being used in like, liquor stores or hotels or something like that. And sometimes, like I said, they're deployed into where they only have a public IP. The ISP sell them on public IP, so they put them public facing as far as the DVRs are concerned. But the problem with how these devices are being made, or the supply chain of the devices, is because it starts from how many people are touching this one code base, or spanning through the attack surfaces. So when you build an embedded device or an IoT device, you start with the PCB here, the board. You then find a BSP, someone who has the driver sets to communicate with your peripherals, so whatever your requirements are. It could be Broadcom, it could be Marvell, most common. Anybody familiar with Broadcom and Marvell? Okay, cool. Next you have ODM. And this is where these hard-coded passwords are being baked in, is from, for example, Zhongmai, which is the specific vendor who created these hard-coded passwords for Mirai, or one aspect, one variant. But there are a number of ones, Edimax. They're usually small companies within China or Taiwan, 15, 10 people who are helping with this code base, maybe a project manager or two. I've been on the calls with them. It's quite funny when you ask them, what type of security controls are in place, and usually they say, well, it has 128-bit HTTPS, it's secure, right? Obviously, there's a lot more to do. But again, this is the most important aspect of the supply chain, and where a lot of this stems from, because there's thin margins. You have to have an end product, and you have to have, again, these are different teams creating the driver sets. So the ODM builds on top of the BSP's code, and the ODM also could, let's say, outsource to another provider to create the USB drivers, like NetUSB is one of them, ROM Pager, if you guys have heard of that. The ODM is where this comes from here, as far as the problems within the space, and again, it's because of margins. When you're building software, you have a number of different teams, a number of different code bases and SDKs. So you have one SDK, another SDK, another SDK, and the OEM is the one who supports that. So we have the cloud service provider. So you have AWS IoT SDK, for example, baked in C++ code. Could be Microsoft Azure IoT. It could be ThingsWorks. It could be Xively. It could be a number of different cloud service providers. But the point of IoT is supposed to be remotely accessible or remotely accessing these devices and managing these devices, right? So of course there's going to be another third party involved in the code base, and then you have whatever the OEM is going to customize from the ODM stack. So let's say you put your logo on there. Now you want to put specific features according to the OEM standards. So that's what happened with these Mirai affected devices. You had the ODM, and they resold it to a number of different OEMs, and they then customized it to their needs. And again, this is in the embedded space, and I don't know if that's ever going to change, unless it's the same thing with Android. Think about Android, the different problems with updates and the different vulnerabilities that are published with certain drivers, like Broadcom driver exploit and vulnerability was published, I think, last month by Google Zero Day Project, for example. These mobile phones are still embedded devices. They still have firmware images. They still have different ODMs as well, hardware manufacturers and even BSPs. So again, this is the supply chain and the aspect of how these devices are built from the ground up. So again, key point here is ODM, original device manufacturer. So let's talk about some common operating systems. Embedded Linux is by far one of the most commonly used operating system. And then you also have really, really old Linux kernels that are being used, like 2.6. And I even said Android here, even old Android images like 4.4. I've seen 4.2, when you go to Kickstarter and you see what these IoT device home security alarms, they're using old Android devices. And this has been shown even with consumer hubs. They have been known to use vulnerable Android versions. But again, embedded Linux in the consumer side, very, very common. You have RTOS, real-time operating system. You have commercial versions like VxWorks, QNX, which is BlackBerry, MQX, Green Hills as well. But one note on RTOS, now we have, let me go back to the supply chain aspect here. Marvell partners with AWS and uses free RTOS. So they have starter IoT SDKs or starter kits where Marvell's using AWS and you have others using different cloud providers. So again, they're trying to bake it in from the start here. But interesting to see how they're partnering up between the BSPs and the cloud service providers. So then you have Windows Embedded. Usually some sort of point of sale or a medical device, like I said. But POS, not the POS you might be thinking about, but maybe. I'm not a big fan of Windows, but you also have Windows IoT Core. But think about the vulnerabilities. There's hundreds of Linux kernel vulnerabilities that published, Dirty Cow, a number of different ones. And these embedded devices are using these legacy kernel code bases, and even Android as well. But similar with Windows, like I said, we have some that are affected by WannaCry because it can't be updated. They're heavily dependent on. And now what you have to do is, so to speak, air gap. But when you have something like bash bunny, like they were talking about at the keynote, might not be as realistic. But this is a big problem here in the space, and definitely affected the embedded area, even though it's XP, but it's XP for embedded, or even CE sometimes. Like kiosks, for example, you'll see running Windows platforms. So embedded Linux, this is the generic or the layout of a firmware image. You have the flash contents, the bootloader, U-boot, Red boot, whatever it may be. And again, similar to Android, if anybody's researched into Android, they have like fast boot, for example. You have a Linux kernel in the file system. Like I said, there's CramFS, SquashFS, a number of different file systems. One thing that's missing here is a compression, whatever's using as compression, LZMA, for example. There's a number of them out there. But just to give you an idea, this is the content of a piece of firmware for embedded Linux. So going into kind of the best practices and how we can make these devices more secure from, let's say, a defensive standpoint or from a manufacturer standpoint. We definitely want to have some buffer and stack overflow protections, some injection protections like command injections and how to prevent command injections from your product, or even how to exploit these from the developer standpoint. Now, what I see is a lot of IoT guidance on attacking or talking about the problems and how these problems aren't going to be fixed. So what I set out to do was create a development document that that developers could use with C, C++ code, compliant examples and non-compliant examples, instead of just PDFs and secure code principles that, again, you shouldn't use vulnerable, let's say, functions within C. So again, we have firmware updates, cryptographic signatures, identity management, and we'll go into details in each and every one of these here. But again, I wanted to make something more actionable, something that developers, and not only developers can use, but also management and even lawyers. I have connections with people over in the States from the FTC who are using this document as a point of reference for negligent manufacturers. So again, I didn't want to create a top 10 just numbered out here, but there's also threat modeling. If any of these manufacturers did any type of basic threat modeling, a lot of these vulnerabilities wouldn't even make it to mass deployment. So here, I have a Git book out here. We'll go through in just a second, just an example of what I have for these practical guidance that, again, developers can use, and not just words and PDF documents that is being discussed out in blogs and given to developers, and like, okay, well, I don't use these web frameworks. I don't know, OWASP, for example. I don't know. I haven't had secure code training. This is, they don't have frameworks in C like they do in Node.js or Rails that will auto escape, dynamic content or whatever it may be. So I set out to, like I said, provide some practical guidance for these developers to use and implement whenever they find any type of issues related to these top, best practices, for example. And again, this is a largely used term. Who's heard of this? Prevent usage of dangerous C functions. Pretty common. It's been around in the 90s. It's been around forever. But an example command, if you have the source code, or even if you reverse engineer a piece of firmware, if it's sometimes they have to publish their full source code if they're using open source. Depending on the license, you can look for vulnerable C functions using something like find command. There's a number of different commands, grep as well. And use safe equivalents. And this is just an example. Our guidance document has plenty of details on alternatives. But also ensure we have secure compiler flags using something like stack canaries. So how firmware images are built are using what's called embedded build systems. So usually the two most common are build root and Yocto. And I'll be talking more about or speaking more on build root. And it basically auto creates your firmware image. You just select which libraries, which services you'd like, configuration files, compiler flags. And here's an example of how build root looks here. Literally just a menu. Very, very simple. And this one's enabling stack protection. So stack canaries, a random integer on the stack. If it's modified, it fails. Think of it like a CSRF protection, CSRF token. A simple, it's a menu option. Not very difficult, but if they knew about it, I'm pretty sure they would select it. But again, I know, from my history over at Linksys, they use build root. So just something to keep in mind. It's not that difficult. Little image for you. Maybe something to post up on, lunchroom, something like that, where the developers hang out. So injection prevention. Again, I'm speaking more towards command injection, even remote code execution or cross-site scripting. But you want to whitelist accepted commands if you're going to use something like ping or netstat, whatever it may be, and escape and properly output and code those dynamic values. And hopefully not dynamic, right? You don't want any user input dynamic because that's how you can exploit these type of vulnerabilities. You can use something like burp, zap, as well as a tool called comics. And a comics is almost like SQL map. Anybody familiar with SQL map? Okay, well, SQL map's a great SQL injection tool, not as relevant in the embedded space, but SQL map-like interface where you can find blind command injection and even just straight away command injection like in your face. You can tell it's executing system commands from the operating system, from the platform specifically, like Linux. Like adding a user, I think I have an example here, a couple. This is actually one exploit that's being used in the wild. I just used ping. I didn't want to go into detail. You can use netcat or use wget, pull down whatever your payload is to gain persistence. But this is a variant of command injection that's being used with that Perserai botnet. So they're adding on to these botnets, by the way. They're not just static. And what they're doing is, again, just exploiting one of the FTP features. And then right now, I just gave a ping command. But there's several different examples or different ways you can use for post-exploitation of these devices. An interesting part of Perserai is that they're also exploiting these P2P cameras. So peer-to-peer cameras. So now it's very hard to track. But I won't go into detail with that. But again, this is one example here. Let's look at a C code example where you have any command, which is dynamic here, and it's not by command buff, and it's not being filtered at all. It's dynamic. Gets fed into system, and now you can use one of these payloads, for example, add a user. And just to show an example for what we have in the Git book, I pulled this up for you guys, is the non-compliant code example, which I have as the slide example, and gives a pretty detailed reason why it's non-compliant and what it does. And again, you have a little forward for every point here. And again, it's Git book, so you can use GitHub and do a pull request or comment directly in as well. We want to keep it as accurate and updated as possible. But then we have compliant examples here. And again, very, very detailed, or as detailed as possible. And we're also looking for contributors, or even if you think it should be explained in a different way, definitely want to hear that. Again, because we have people who are non-technical reading this as well. And then also different considerations to think about, and references where it's being attacked in the wild, or even how to prevent from just different outside sources. So, and again, that was just one example, but there's definitely loads out there that we have. One of the threat modeling points that I'm going to publish for our guidance document is showing, because I'm writing this for my book, so we have IoT's like home environment and how to a basic threat model of identifying assets, identifying threats, and then the entry points, and then risk rating each threat and the likelihood as well and the impact. So that'll be cool. I haven't seen that done in detail just yet, but it'll help, I think, the greater industry. So we have firmware updates. We definitely want those over TLS. Automatic if possible, but we also have medical devices where you can't just update these medical devices like pacemakers, whatever it may be, whenever there's an update. But if there is a high, let's say, criticality vulnerability published, try to force updates if possible, and have some anti-downgrade or rollback protections. And I've seen this already with some providers and DVR manufacturers, and even commercial side, where you can't, and even think about like iOS versions. You can't use previous like iOS 8 versions on your phone because they only sign certain version numbers. But again, it's anti-rollback protection is what it is. And again, mobile phones are still embedded devices, and similar to IoT in general. And again, cryptographically signed and verify updates. Again, a good example of who does that are anybody from the medical, not the medical, but the ICS industrial control system, regulated space, because they have to, certain devices, as well as, like I said, Apple is one of them. One important thing too is to verify or look at the change logs. And again, BuildRoot is a tool that's used to build these firmware images. So they also have, they use their own, let's say, UPnP libraries, and it could be vulnerable. Vulnerable Samba libraries, for example, which there's a new Samba, vulnerability out there right now, remote code execution that got published, I think 2 days ago or something like that. So again, I doubt that you're basically tied to whatever BuildRoot uses unless you update individually or per project. And you also want to make sure the firmware versions are clearly displayed. So an example of just verifying a signed package, this is just a kernel package, and it's nothing too specific or too crazy. It could be any package, it could be any library or any service, but I just chose to do the kernel for this example using GPG. And I understand GPG could be a little bit difficult of a learning curve for some developers to understand as far as the structure of public key, private key, and updating the keys when they expire because the device may brick, which has happened. I'm either sending the device back. But again, just wgetting here, checking the key server to see where the signature is bound. When you use GPG, you have some sort of web of trust, so you have to verify outside of band. This is just verifying the firmware image against the signature as well. So securing sensitive information, preaching to the choir here, but hard coding passwords, tokens, but also the way you save that data. If you're using an ARM device, which is really, really common, it's probably one of the most common architectures for these embedded devices. You can use a trusted execution environment. Otherwise, use something like a secure element or a TPM. And again, this varies by industry. Like I said, within commercial or more regulated spaces like ICS, you will probably need something like a secure element to store this information, like a hardware security module. Put it that way, think of it that way. You don't want to store these secrets in unprotected storage like flash or EEPROM, where they can be taken off the chip and just read the contents, for example. Or I've even seen developers store sensitive information in a different partition of the firmware in memory, which again can still be pulled off. Which seems like common sense, but again, not really. When you have a manufacturer's hard code backdoors or bypassing authentication using a user agent header, pretty simple. And this is for a D-Link router. It's about a couple years back, but again, as long as you send that user agent header, you have access to the device. I won't get too much into this, but they got slapped in the hand this year by the FTC, them as well as ASUS, for doing things like this and putting people basically at safety dangers and also falsely advertising easy to secure advanced network security and using default hard-coded login credentials and guest by default. So that's something new for us in the States. Is we have regulation trying to get involved in a way where now these manufacturers are getting fined, and now they also have to have pen tests conducted for the next 20 years. So again, this is pretty interesting from the IoT space and consumer space where this hasn't happened, especially when it's kind of a free-for-all in essence. But again, hoping that this document can help manufacturers and prevent something like hard-coded passwords and credentials like this again. This is the root password for the personal I backdoor. So let me run through again. I think I'm running a little bit less over time. So we have identity management. Separate, let's say console credentials and web credentials, as well as secure your session IDs and cookies. Password change upon installation. I've seen that with new DVRs now. I've purchased 3 or 4 of them just so I can do some research. And now once I connect it to the network, it makes me change the password, update the firmware. So some manufacturers are learning from the mistakes of Mirai, which is good. And again, this is consumer space too. And then some password policies, not so much complexity, but let's say history and changing those passwords, as well as putting EEPROM and UART passwords from the hardware aspect. So whenever you try to pull firmware, it may not be possible. I know we did a 32-character password for UART at Balkan when you try to access the UART interfaces. So good luck trying to brute force that.
Have you tested SSL man in the middling? Any of the firmware updates?
Yes, I have.
Any success?
Yeah, that's how you pull. That's how I pull some of the firmware, because they're very strict on some of them on pulling the firmware or trying to reverse engineer it. But yes, I have had some success.
Okay, but can you upload your own? Like, does the device itself?
It depends, because you'll have them brick sometimes if you have incorrect drivers. We'll talk about it a little bit after running out of time. Let me just go through this real quick. Harden basically, remove legacy insecure daemons, FTP, TFTP, Telnet, and again, this is build root. Only using one shell interpreter, taking off FTP, enabling OpenSSH, for example, and then again, we don't want to use any hard-coded or backdoors, but they usually have an excuse of we need it for debugging purposes or customer support. And again, unfortunately, this is so common. And usually they run a unit test from the OEM standpoint. Like, it looks good to me. And this is Stevie Wonder, he's blind. So they're not looking at it at all. Skip through TLS. We all know, we want to use secure defaults and not SSL, TLS, because SSL is never safe. Just running through the last couple of points here. This is just privacy by design, acquiring the required data for business functions. This is something that EU as well as FTC is pushing, but it's hard to get traction when privacy doesn't, translate to dollars. Who does this good? Again, going back to mobile, Android, iOS. Last point here is third-party code and components and verifying or using tools to help with the automation of this. And you have different software stack that you're using, Node.js, and also web for OAuth for web testing. And you utilize package managers as well to update. You don't have to basically flash the whole firmware, depending on the image that's being used. And here's just a tool. It's called Lip Scanner, an example. So I'm running through these. I'm running out of time, guys. Sorry about that. Last point, rinse and repeat. Continuous threat models is what we want. Every time I submit a bug to a manufacturer, I always let them know about disclosure policies as well as involvement in the community, like using someone like crowdsourced application security like BugCrowd, HackerOne, and also point them to similar manufacturers to help them, be more aware. And it's a team sport here, team game. We're all trying to, we all have the same goals is the idea. Some closing thoughts. Still 0 day if they didn't update, technically. Still use the same 0 day. Let's keep breaking things. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. That was awesome. We have about 2 minutes before the next session's supposed to begin. Were there any burning questions that you wanted to ask, Aaron?
I'll be outside.
Okay, there you go. So he'll be outside. Everyone give him another round of applause for a job very well done. Thank you. And we have a little gift from AusCERT for you to thank you for your time. Yeah, it's totally not hackable, not IoT at all. It's a cutting board. So thanks everyone for coming. And the next talk that's going to be in this room is Abusing Voice Biometric Solutions by Jacob Kaluzny. If you want to stick around. Thanks. Are you Jacob? Yep. Hey, I'm Melody. I'm just chairing here. So.